so what we're seeing here is that across all the different imaging modalities that we have here, so different types of MRI images, we have CT images, but also fluorescence microscopy and electron microscopy. Across all these different modalities, different image sizes, spacings, anisotropies, etc. And then nnU-Net is able to, in this case here, qualitatively produce really nice outputs. But before we start with the meat of the presentation, I'd like to quickly say a couple words about Helmholtz Imaging, which is the organization within Helmholtz that I am associated with, just so that you understand maybe a little more what my current background is and what my current objectives are. So in Helmholtz, which is the German tax-funded research association, there are lots of different centers, I think 16, 17, 18 or so different centers, of which the DKFZ is just one. And these centers are associated with different research areas. So there's, for example, health here, which would be where the DKFZ is located. But what people noticed within Helmholtz is that all these research areas essentially have one really important common denominator, which is images. So they all acquire images, they all analyze images. And born from this observation, Helmholtz Imaging was born as like a central organization within Helmholtz where expertise with everything related to imaging can be bundled and cross-domain synergies can be leveraged. So the mission here of this Helmholtz Imaging organization is to unlock the potential of imaging in the Helmholtz Association, and of course also go beyond and see how we can benefit imaging communities around the globe. Helmholtz Imaging as a whole is designed to work across all steps of the so-called imaging pipeline, so from data acquisition to data preparation, management, and data analysis. And where I'm obviously located is more towards the end of the spectrum here, where semantic segmentation is, for example, one important aspect of the work we do. Helmholtz Imaging is distributed across 3 different Helmholtz centers. That's MDC in Berlin, DESY in Hamburg, and the DKFZ located in Heidelberg. And my group is actually part of the DKFZ Helmholtz Imaging unit. And our lab is called Applied Computer Vision Lab, and we essentially do anything that's automated image analysis. So we help people with strategies for annotating data sets. We build, of course, AI models. We use out-of-the-box solutions like nnU-Net, and we are also involved in organizing competitions and helping to evaluate competitions. But now let's start with the meat of the presentation. nnU-Net is a self-configuring method for deep learning-based image segmentation. And I think in this room, everybody will be familiar with semantic segmentation. I just want to highlight here that semantic segmentation is also a type of image analysis problem that's being used across many different imaging domains. So we have something like street scene segmentation here, then some electron microscopy images from biology, and of course also medical images, which is where I essentially originate from with my background. If we look into the competition landscape, so challenges like you would also know them from Kaggle and the like, and if we look at the competition landscape in the biomedical imaging domain, we also see that segmentation plays a major role, essentially accounting for about 70% of all the competitions that were being reviewed as part of this publication down here. With segmentation being such a hot topic and being used all the time, so what I really would like to have in an ideal world, so if we have a new application for which we need a segmentation algorithm, something like a really nice big red button that we can just press that takes some data set along with corresponding annotations, and out comes a fully configured and trained model that can then be used to run prediction on unseen data. The real world is unfortunately very different. So instead of a really nice big red button, we have a really nice and wonderful PhD student or postdoc or master student or whatever who is being tasked with developing a model for a specific application. This PhD student also typically has some kind of GPU resources that they can use, and in most of the cases, unless you work for Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., these resources are rather limited, so you really have to be efficient with the way you're working. So what does the PhD student / master student / postdoc do? They have to look at all the different parts that make up a segmentation pipeline And this includes all the quote unquote boring parts that nobody actually ever really is interested in, something like how do I do the preprocessing, how do I do intensity normalization, if I have different image sizes, or in medical images, something like voxel spacing, how do I resize my images so that everything is kind of homogeneous and models can work with it. Then I need to then I need to think about what network architecture I would like to use. That's something people really like to do because you can write really nice research papers if you get nice new architectural variants, but also something like network topology is really important to think about because you need to essentially build something that can make use of whatever input size or input patches you're giving it. You need to think about what kind of loss function you would like to use and how you would like to configure your hyperparameters. How the network training is going to take place also plays a huge role in model performance. Finally, maybe some post-processing and ensembling. And in the end, once you have configured all this, you run it, you train it, you evaluate it. The question is the performance satisfying? Have I achieved, so to speak, a global optimum of my pipeline or not? And if that is the, and all of this, sorry, is of course something that's not as easy to set. So you cannot just wiggle one thing and leave the others alone. All of these different parameters and things that you do when you build a pipeline interact with each other. There's like really complex dependencies between those. And it can be really difficult to find a configuration that works really nicely in the end. And if you don't have something like a challenge data set where you know what kind of performance you should be expecting from your pipeline, it's also really difficult to say when can I actually stop optimizing my method, like when is the optimum reached or am I maybe stuck somewhere. But if everything has been taken care of and you've done everything, finally then you can deploy your model or apply it to the test data or something like that. The problem with this approach, I think, is quite obvious. It's mostly driven by trial and error processes. People also sometimes like to call it the grad student descent. And as such, it's really time consuming and maybe also inefficient. How well this works in the end, the model that comes out of it highly depends on the experience of the researcher. So we've actually in our lab done some experiments where we asked multiple people to build a standard nnU-Net for the same data set. And the solutions they came up with for the standard nnU-Net were all like vastly different in terms of their performance. So really saying something like, I trained a nnU-Net and this is the outcome is by no means a standardized nnU-Net performance or something like that. And because all these parameters here interact with each other, you really need to know what they do and how do they behave in different situations. This whole process is inherently inaccessible to non-experts. So if you're a domain scientist or say in this context here, a medical doctor who has a data set and needs a segmentation model for it, you essentially have to go talk to a computer scientist and you cannot really do this yourself, at least not as successfully maybe as an expert could do it for you. What kind of aggravates this whole thing a little bit is that, at least so this is speaking from the perspective of the biomedical domain, data sets are extremely heterogeneous. So it's not like you can build a nnU-Net for a brain tumor segmentation problem and then take that same nnU-Net and apply it to prostate segmentation or liver segmentation. Essentially, all these data sets, they have different voxel spacing, different modalities, different image sizes, different class imbalance ratios, etc., which causes you essentially to have to rebuild your model more or less from scratch for each of those data sets. So this entire process that's already inefficient and already expert dependent and kind of hard to discern like what really helps and what doesn't is aggravated by the fact that for each of the little data sets that we have typically in application-driven domains, for each of these data sets, you need to repeat the process and do it all over again. Interestingly, this problem also has, I would say, severe consequences for the literature landscape. So if you think about the nnU-Net, which is by far the most popular architecture in the biomedical domain, at least, it's being used everywhere. It's being used for every data set. And people like to take some nnU-Net on some data set, produce some kind of performance, then introduce some architectural modification to it, say, for the sake of current hypes, plug a visual transformer in it and call it visual like transformer unit or whatever. and then compare whatever they've come up with some baseline that they have produced according to the process I just described above. And the problem here really is that the standardized U-Net baseline is probably not ideal. These people do not have an incentive to optimize their baseline properly because they want to beat it. And also because of this dataset problem where you have to redo everything for every dataset, typically evaluation is only done on a small number of datasets, and dataset in our domain means maybe 50, if you're lucky, 100 training cases. So a lot of noise is to be expected in the outcome or in the results. So the problem with method evaluation in this context and with the literature landscape here is that often things are being proposed and it's difficult to evaluate them properly, and it's often not being done properly. And also the U-Net baselines are by no means standardized, because I mean the original U-Net was for cell segmentation, and then the original 3D U-Net was for some 3D segmentation problem, which is vastly different from everything it's being applied to. So what is the U-Net baseline performance really, and how reliable is it? So what we set out was to build something that kind of tackles all these problems, and we call it nnU-Net, and we like to describe it as an out-of-the-box tool that automatically configures entire state-of-the-art segmentation pipelines without requiring expert knowledge or extensive compute resources to run. So what do we want this kind of thing to be? I mean, you can also, of course, just say, hey, so why don't you use AutoML and network architecture search and whatever? But the thing here is that we really want this to be out of the box without requiring any expert knowledge. And the important bit is we want this to run on standard deep learning hardware. So we don't want people who are looking to use this to have a high performance GPU cluster with 500 plus GPUs in it, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to design nnU-Net for real world data sets. So really something that can be 2D, 3D, typically has few training cases. So not something like cityscapes, et cetera. You will never beat dedicated cityscape segmentation approaches with something like nnU-Net. It's just not what it's designed for. We want nnU-Net to just be this red button that I described at the very beginning of the presentation. So a button you press and the entire pipeline is being configured and trained, and out comes the final trained model. So how are we hoping to achieve this? I think it's rather could be really difficult depending on how you approach this, and we approached it the very pragmatic way, which is a strategy I really like to operate with, is to be pragmatic, find the easiest solutions. And here this was we call this turn domain knowledge into inductive. This is supposed to be biases to shortcut any potential empirical optimization. So what does this look like in practice? It's something I'd like to show you a little bit in the next couple of slides. The overarching design principle behind nnU-Net is that we distinguish all the different parts of the pipeline that I also already mentioned previously in 3 different sets of parameters, and follow what we call a 3-step recipe to define these 3 sets of parameters. And in this context, I should mention that the original nnU-Net was initially developed as part of our contribution to the medical segmentation decathlon, which was a competition where participants were being tasked with providing one algorithm that could train and then predict segmentations from 10 different data sets. So you could retrain for every data set, but your method had to be fully automatic, so you weren't allowed to do manual per dataset annotation for your method. So let's get back to the 3-step recipe. And the first part of this recipe is what we call fixed parameters. So these parameters to us are design decisions for which we can find a robust common configuration for all datasets. So those that do not require any kind of manual adaptation when we switch to different datasets. So these are just the things we define once, and they stay like that forever. To give you an idea of what this is, so for example, in nnU-Net, but this is of course something that's always debatable, is we like to use a specific learning rate schedule. We like to use a combination of dice and cross entropy loss. And what was really important to me back then and still is that the type of network architecture we are using is always nnU-Net-like and uses as little of the fancy stuff as possible, just to highlight how good a standard nnU-Net can be if you do everything properly. So that's also what kind of coined the name. The nnU-Net is like a phonetic abbreviation for no new nnU-Net or no nnU-Net, just to highlight that we don't need architectural modifications to get good segmentation performance, at least in the biomedical domain. So yeah, I think it's not important to read all of these out. There are just a couple of things that are fixed in nnU-Net, and if you're interested in learning more about that, I recommend the publication that we have with nnU-Net. So the next parameters are what we call the rule-based parameters, and this is essentially where this condensing of domain knowledge to shortcut empirical optimization is at home. So essentially, we from all these different segmentation problems that we have solved over the years, we have in our heads accumulated a lot of knowledge, or you could call it domain knowledge, on how to design a method for a specific data set, or like what adaptations, manual adaptations would I need to make for this new given data set? Like what would be my educated first guess? And these kinds of things, we have essentially just tried to formulate them into some form of code and make this formulation dependent on what does the new data set look like. So essentially what we have is we have some training data set, which is here on the left. And then from this training data set, we extract some important or what we deem to be important characteristics, something like what are the image spacings, because this method was originally designed for biomedical applications. So something like image spacing is always an important information to have. What are the shapes that we have? Is it 2D? Is it 3D? What's the intensity distribution like? What types of imaging modalities do we have, etc., etc. And from this information, given this domain knowledge and the rules that we kind of formulated in form of code, we can set a lot of different pipeline parameters, something like how do we do image resampling, what target spacing do we select, how is normalization being done, and also the entire batch size, patch size, network topology question is also something that's solved in here. You can kind of see this here, but this is also something I'd like to show you a little bit in more detail on the next slide. So for this network topology, batch size, patch size thing, the domain knowledge that, or the external constraints that we have to consider are, for example, that we know that optimization, like stochastic gradient descent optimization, works better with larger batch sizes up to some sweet spot, because you get more accurate gradient estimates for what your optimal solution is. We at the same time also know that, especially for 3D images where patch sizes can be constrained, larger patch sizes typically perform a little bit better because they allow to capture more contextual information, which may be interesting or may be needed for some data sets. And we also know that if we put a large patch size into a network, we also need to design the network such that it is able to capture all the contextual information that it is provided. So it doesn't make sense to have a large input and then do two pooling operations in the network topology, because then whatever part in the network can only see a small fraction of the input. So we want the network to see the entire input, essentially. In a real-world application, we cannot just crank up the batch size, the patch size, and build the network topology accordingly, because then we get a problem with GPU memory consumption. And again, here, this constraint of we want this to be able to run on standard deep learning hardware comes into play. So we need to make sure to find the right balance. And another thing that we know from our initial or from our experience with other segmentation problems is that we generally prefer a larger patch size over batch size. So the way we condense this kind of domain knowledge and constraints into nnU-Net, and this is now the actual procedure that happens inside of nnU-Net, is that we start with some initial patch size, which is purposefully chosen to be way too large for the GPU to handle. So essentially, we start with the entire image size here. We run this network topology configuration. We ask whether this network topology configuration with this patch size and at least a batch size of 2, which is another constraint that we have, fits into GPU memory. If that's the case, then everything is fine. If that's not the case, then we need to reduce the patch size and kind of run around this iteratively until we find essentially the largest patch size that fits into GPU memory with the given a certain architecture configuration. And then in the end, here we have our batch size, our patch size, and the network topology. So that was just to dive into a little bit into one of the aspects here of these rule-based parameters and give you a little bit of an insight what happens inside nnU-Net. That's of course not everything, but I will not go through all the different steps here. I think that's beyond the scope of this presentation and also probably going to be really boring for you. Finally, after the rule-based parameters, we have what we call the empirical parameters. So some empirical optimization is still needed also in nnU-Net. So whatever we weren't able to fix as part of the fixed parameters and the rule-based parameters, we now need to do empirically. And the first thing that we need to do here is figure out which model to use or what type of ensembling we want to use. And essentially what nnU-Net does is it doesn't just configure one U-Net architecture, but it actually does 3 different U-Net configurations. The first one being just a regular 2D U-Net, which operates on a slice basis. Then we have a 3D full resolution U-Net, which just takes the images at their native resolution and processes them with as large a patch size as the previously mentioned constraint allows. And then finally, we have a 3D U-Net cascade, which kind of tries to compensate for potential lack of contextual information in the 3D U-Net. So what we do here essentially is to first start with a low resolution U-Net where most of the image fits into a patch size, and then refine the segmentation that we get from the low resolution by a second high resolution U-Net. And in nnU-Net, we can either just pick one of the 3 configurations or let nnU-Net automatically determine, like train all 3 of them and determine which of the 3 or which combination of the 3 should be used for predicting the test cases or for running inference. And another point that nnU-Net optimizes empirically is the post-processing, but this is something that is really quick, so it's by no means as expensive as network trainings. It's just some CPU-based optimization on the validation sets to determine whether like everything except the largest connected component should be removed. So this is something that's useful, for example, for organ segmentation or something like that. So if you do a liver segmentation and you have some false positive predictions somewhere, then this is a post-processing technique that can kind of remove that. Although I should say that this post-processing rarely actually really does a lot. So it's more like to get the last percentile out of like the last percent out of nnU-Net or something like that. So it's not something that's inherently required. So if we plug all of these things together, we have this huge overview here with all the different components. We have the fixed parameters, the data fingerprint, the rule-based parameters that are connected to it. We have empirical optimization here in the 3D U-Net configurations. And all of this works together in a software framework. And the nice thing about that is that if you just want a segmentation method for your segmentation problem, you don't have to care about any of that, because this really is the magician or the big red button that you press and everything runs automatically. And in the end, you get something like nnU-Net will literally tell you, use this command to predict your test cases, and you just use that. And you can trust that it's a solid U-Net performance that you're getting here. How does it perform in practice? As part of the publication that we wrote, we evaluated nnU-Net on 23 data sets from the biomedical domain. All these data sets came from competition data sets so that we can compare our performance against other segmentation approaches. What you're seeing here is qualitative results from a couple of data sets. In each of these subplots to the left is the raw data overlaid with the predicted segmentation, and on the right is a 3D rendering to highlight that all these problems, at least the ones I'm showing here, are of 3D nature. And so what we're seeing here is that across all the different imaging modalities that we have here, so different types of MRI images, we have CT images, but also fluorescence microscopy and electron microscopy. Across all these different modalities, different image sizes, spacings, anisotropies, etc. And nnU-Net is able to, in this case here, qualitatively produce really nice outputs, and there's essentially no clear failure case or something like that where nnU-Net doesn't deliver. Also quantitatively, if we compare nnU-Net against the others on the respective leaderboards, we see that the performance is quite encouraging. So all the competing methods, like what you're seeing here in each of these subplots, is one label of one data set and the corresponding leaderboard. So you see nnU-Net as a red dot and the competing methods as blue dots. And what we see here across the bank is that nnU-Net is the top performing, or at least among the top performing methods for all these different data sets. And actually, at the time of submitting the paper, we were in first place in 33 out of 53 segmentation tasks. And what was really encouraging about this was that we were able to achieve this despite with nnU-Net, where we didn't touch anything essentially, and we were able to outcompete specialized handcrafted solutions. So for each of these data sets, people like specifically optimized a segmentation method with this, you could say, trial and error procedure I outlined at the beginning. And despite them specifically optimizing for each respective data set, nnU-Net was able to get highly competitive performance. So that was really cool. I already mentioned at the start that nowadays you cannot win competitions with blank nnU-Net anymore. That is because everybody has it. It's open source on GitHub. So when we participate in competitions, we also have to essentially compete against ourselves. But what this causes is a really nice and I would say again refreshing competition landscape where things have gotten really difficult. And what I'd like to highlight here is that in this context, nnU-Net is often being used or can be used as a strong starting point for task-specific optimizations. And there are 3 success stories from our lab here, but also if you look at the segmentation challenge winners in 2020 from Mikai, 9 out of 10 from them essentially used nnU-Net as a starting point or built their winning solution at the basis of nnU-Net. So while you cannot use standard nnU-Net anymore to win competitions, you can use it to develop your method and to incorporate specific changes for each data set to get you over the finish line. And what was especially heartwarming for us was that even the man himself, Olaf Ronneberger, gave us a warm recommendation. So that's also something we appreciated a lot. Yeah, so that brings us back to the initial question. Are we one step closer to the ideal segmentation world? And I would say a step closer, definitely. We are probably not there yet, but nnU-Net can already do a lot for a lot of applications. And it's really nice to see that that even with new applications and new data sets coming, it's able to, we haven't found a single failure case yet, essentially. So it always works really nicely, sometimes, of course, a little bit better than others, but always gives good results. And so nnU-Net makes, I think, or I hope, a lot of people happy. So, for example, domain experts now have the ideal world in their real world. They can use nnU-Net out of the box without having to know too much about programming. So some basic Python skills are still required, but you definitely do not need any AI expertise, and you can get essentially state-of-the-art performance for each of the custom data sets you might have, and you get it within a standard frame, like a standard amount, like with a standard amount of compute resources. AI researchers are, at least I like to believe, also happy about it, because this whole mess with the U-Net baselines that was before is now a little bit solved, because we have nnU-Net as a standardized baseline that gives you a very good indication of what a reasonable U-Net should perform, like how a reasonable U-Net should perform on a given data set. nnU-Net offers a new perspective on method configuration, because you can now also, of course, go back and try to make the different heuristics and fixed parameters within nnU-Net better, and then, or you can also, if you, for example, want to evaluate a new loss function that you have developed, you can plug it into nnU-Net and then let nnU-Net handle all the problems with the different data sets for you, so that you can concentrate on evaluating your loss function and let nnU-Net take care of the rest. So that's also what we mean with framework for dataset agnostic method development.